In this video, we're going to discuss how to avoid plagiarism when you're using borrowed language from a source. So borrowed language means the exact language that the source uses. And of course, the main point is that you want to put borrowed language or exact language from a source inside quotation marks. So a good rule of thumb is if you are using more than 3 words in a row from a source, put them inside quotation marks. And that means borrowed language, exact language from a source, must be put in quotation marks even if the borrowed language is just a statement of fact. If it's the same wording, it needs to be in quotation marks. It also means that even if it's just a list of short words or phrases, right, just a list, if it's the exact same wording, you have to put it in quotation marks. And even if it just involves numbers and statistics, if the wording the source uses to present those numbers and statistics is what you're also using, then that wording has to be put in quotation marks. There are a couple small exceptions here. You do not have to put the names of organizations or things in quotation marks. Sometimes you get a big, long name, and even if the name or title is more than 3 words, you don't have to put it in quotation marks because people will understand that's just the title of that organization or thing. It's not something that's unique to a particular source. Same thing for an expert's credentials. You know, sometimes an expert's credentials will be quite long. For example, a director of the World Health Organization on, health and wellness, some big long title. But people will understand that's not something just from a particular source. That's the way the person's credentials would be described in any case. But other than those two, if you're using borrowed language, exact language from a source, it needs to be in quotation marks or else it's going to turn up on Turnitin. Be flagged by that. Of course, in all of these cases, if you put the borrowed language into your own words, which means you're using both different wording and a different sentence structure, then you don't have to use quotation marks. But even then, you still have to provide a citation in either the signal phrase or parentheses to indicate where the information comes from. And that citation should include the first word of the works cited entry that it comes from. All right, so let's look at some examples here to illustrate all of this. And I have here an article from a database by Denise Chen about postpartum depression. So I'd like you to pause the video, read this passage from the article, and then read these 5 lettered student examples. And based on this original article and what we talked about, I want you to write down for each lettered example whether you think it's plagiarized or not, and then I'll come back and give you my commentary on it. All right, so you can pause the video now and then we'll come back and I'll discuss it. Okay, coming back, let's look at A first. So A is plagiarism because that sentence there is exactly the same as the sentence here. And even though it's a statement of fact, it uses the same wording. So that should have been in quotes with a signal phrase in front of it. It's not enough just to put a parenthetical citation at the end because you need to show that that's exact wording. So that is a very flagrant plagiarism. All right, looking at B. B is also plagiarism because this part is almost exactly the same as the sentence in here. They've just changed 2 words. Instead of saying most common, they're saying instead more frequent. But the sentence structure is the same and all of that other wording is the same in there. So you can see that this is the passage that we're looking at here. Okay, almost exactly the same. All right, C. C is also plagiarism because, again, it's another passage where it's a list, right? And the list is exactly the same as well as some of the wording in front of it, right? So here is what they're doing. They changed the word from core to main and as to are, but that whole list is exactly the same. And even though it's a list, and you might feel like, well, how else could I reword that? Well, don't reword it then if you can't put it in quotes, because if it's the same wording, it needs to be in quotation marks. D is also plagiarism. So look at that passage there. That's almost exactly the same as right here. I think one word was changed. Instead of saying the prevalence, it says the incidence. And all of those numbers are exactly the same. And again, I hear people say, well, how else can I reword that? Well, if you can't reword it, you quote it. So, all right. And then E is not plagiarism, because that one has taken the exact language and put it inside quotes. And this is an example with a list here, right? So this was quite a long list here, right? Basically that part of it there. And you know, because it would be very hard to reword that list, they just quoted it. So even though we have some examples here that are numbers or lists or facts, if it uses the same wording as the source, it still has to be in quotation marks. Otherwise, that'll be lighted up, highlighted, and turn it in as plagiarism. So unless you're really changing both the wording and the sentence structure, you need to quote. All right. Let me look at a second set of examples, and I'm going to get rid of that so we can bring this up closer to the original article. I have some articles here, or some lettered examples here, where I'm asking whether or not quotation marks are really needed where they're used, because these might deal with some of the exceptions. So pause the video. If you need to reread the original again, you can, but read these four, F through I, and decide whether the quotation marks are needed or not. And then I'll come back and give you my commentary on it. All right, coming back, the quotations in F are needed because that's the exact wording, right? It's a fact, but they've used the exact same wording as the source, so they need to have that in quotation marks. G, they didn't need the quotation marks, because even though this is what, 1, 2, 3, 4 words long, it's the title of a disorder. So because it's a title, it didn't need to be in quotation marks, even though it's more than 3 words. Same thing in H, the World Health Organization Committee on Mental Health. That's what, 7 words, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 actually. But because it's a title, it doesn't need to be in quotes as though it was original language from that source. But the part here does need to be in quotes because that list comes from the end of that quote there, right? So it does need to be in, it's actually this part here, it does need to be in quotes because it's exact language, it's not just a title. And then here, those quotes are necessary because even though it's just presenting statistics, it is using the exact sentence structure and the exact wording as the original, so it needed to be in quotes. All right, let's look at 3 more things here that are really just little mistakes, almost typos that people make that cause a passage in your paper to be flagged as plagiarism by turning it in, even when it may not be. So I want you to look at these so you can kind of avoid this. So pause it and see if you can see what's causing these to come up as plagiarism, even when they're probably not. All right, coming back here, the person here forgot to put their end quote here, right? They put the quote at the beginning, but if you forget to put it at the end, it'll be flagged by plagiarism as though you didn't quote it. So make sure you've got quotes on both sides there. Here in K, the problem was they left a space after the initial quote. And if you leave a space after the initial quote, it'll come up and be highlighted on turn it in. So don't leave a space between the quote and the first letter or between the end and the last quote. And lastly here, this writer only used the single hash quotation marks. And if you do that, that'll come up as a plagiarized passage on Turnitin. So use the double quotation marks in order to avoid that. All right, so those are just some tips for you on how to avoid plagiarism when you're working with borrowed language. And of course, The main concept here is you put borrowed language, exact language from a source, inside quotation marks. If you put it in your own words and with a different sentence structure, then you don't have to have quotation marks, but you do have to cite where it came from.